Chapter 6 of Human Resource Management will talk about the selection and placement. In this chapter, the following requirements to use in a personal selection device are discussed. What are the areas that are needed to be discussed in these requirements? So these are reliability, validity, generalizability, utility, and legality. Now, the following methods of selections are being discussed in terms of the following factors that were discussed a while ago, and then how the methods will work in practice, and how they can be improved for usage. For example, when to use all those requirements that I have mentioned earlier. That is going to be in terms of in terms of interviews, in terms of the reference checks, in terms of biographical information that are needed for you to be known to the interviewees, and then the physical ability to convey messages and information through test. The cognitive ability tests are also part of it. Personality, inventories has to be also pronounced and divulged in those series of tests. And then work sample tests are also to be engaged by allowing the applicant to do and be assessed accordingly based on the work samples. Honesty tests are also being integrated in these measures. And then drug test is important also in today's yeah selection and placement. Now, the importance of the use of multiple measures are being recognized, and these multiple judges are also being engaged in the selection process. Now, after the discussion, uh, what are the objectives for us to be able to establish? So, after studying this chapter, we will be able to establish the basic scientific properties of the selection methods, including reliability, validity, and generalizability. Now, we will be able also be able to understand and discuss how the particular characteristic of a job, the organization, or applicant affect the utility of any testing materials or test that he has to undergo. We will be able to also describe the government's role in the personnel selection decisions, particularly in the areas of constitutional law, the federal laws, the executive orders, judicial precedent. So all of this in the context of how the government will allow its established participation. Now we will be also understand and list the common methods that is going to be used in the selecting human resources. And then at the same time, we will be able to determine the degree to which each of the common methods used in the selection process of human resources will meet the demands of the reliability, of the validity, and the generalizability, utility, and the legality, all present. Okay. Now, in the selection and placement, uh, the chapter will actually familiarize students with ways to minimize the errors in employee selection and placement. And doing so will improve the organization's competitive advantage and position. The five selection method standards will be actually discussed, which is apparently I've been telling about earlier, the reliability, validity, generalizability, utility, and legality. Now, first, what is reliability? When you say reliability, it is the degree to which a measure of physical or cognitive abilities or traits is free from the random error. So that is very reliability. Now, if a measure of a stable characteristic is reliable, scores of a person received will be consistent over time and over different contexts. Now, the reliability but insufficient characteristic of a good measuring device will also be determined. Now, the true scores and the reliability of measures, it is a concept of reliability that is demonstrated by measuring the height at different times. Even though height is supposedly a stable characteristic, slightly different results are generated every height is measured even. Now each measurement is then composed of true height and error of measurement. Now the average of all the errors, ignoring the positive or negative value, is referred to as the reliability of a measurement. Now, reliability in this example referred to the measuring instruments, okay, a ruler versus visual guess, rather than to the characteristic in itself. Now, we try to assess further. No? The correlation coefficient is now being measured of the degree to which two sets of numbers are related. The correlation coefficient expresses the strength of the relationship in numerical form. Now, a perfect positive relationship will equal plus 1.0. A perfect negative relationship equals negative 1.0. Okay, I repeat. A positive relationship equals plus 1.0. A perfect negative relationship equals negative 1.0. Now, when assessing the reliability of a measure, we might be interested in knowing how scores on the measure at one time relate to scores on the same measure at another time. This is what is called assessing test or retest reliability. I will repeat, assessing test, retest reliability. Now, for standards for reliability, clearly the more reliable the measure, the more likely decisions can be made on score differences. There are many ways to increase the reliability of a test, including writing clear and unambiguous items and increasing the length of a test. Now, validity is now being measured. Now, validity is the extent to which a performance measure assesses all the relevant and only the relevant aspects of job performance. Now, we call it also criterion-related validation. Criterion-related validation. Now, what is criterion-related validation? Now, it is a method of establishing the validity of a personal selection method by showing a substantial correlation between test scores and job performance scores. Now, there are two types of criterion-related validity. So what are these? So number one is the predictive validation. Now, in a predictive validation, is a criterion-related validity study that seeks to establish an empirical relationship between applicants' test scores and their eventual performance on the job. Okay. Next is the concurrent validation. The concurrent validation is a criterion-related validity study in which a test is administered to all people currently in a job and then incumbents, so those who are already there, Uh, and okay, so the people currently in a job and then incumbents, and their scores are correlated with existing measures of their performance on the job. Okay. Now, the predictive validation is superior to concurrent validation for three reasons. Job applicants are typically motivated to perform well on the tests than are current employees. Number two, current employees have learned many things on the job that applicants have not yet learned. And number three, current employees tend to be homogeneous. Okay? Now, satisfactory level of validity are typically defined by statistical significance. And then next is the content validation. The content validation is a test validation strategy, normally performed by demonstrating that the items, questions, or problems posed by a test are a representative sample of the kind of situations or problems that may occur on the job. There are two limitations to content validation. So, what are these limitations? The person who is hired must have the knowledge, must have the skills, must have the abilities at the time he or she was hired. Now, subjective judgment plays such a large role in content validation. Next is the generalizability. Now, in the generalizability, it is the degree to which the validity of a selection method establishes in one context extend to the other context. Now, what are the factors that are needed to be determined in generalizability? Okay, so it was once believed that the validity coefficients were situationally specific. Uh, when you say situationally specific, that is the level of correlational between test and performance would vary as one went from one organization to another, even though the job still seems to be identical. Okay, and then another one is it was also believed that tests showed differential subgroup validity, which means that the validity coefficients for any test job performance was different for people or different races of different genders even. Okay, next is the utility. Now, utility is the degree to which the information provided by selection method enhances the effectiveness of selecting personnel in real organizations. Now, the utility is impacted by reliability, validity, and generalizability. Now, other factors will influence the utility even when the latter is constant. For example, the selection ratio, which is the percentage of people tested versus the total number of applicants, will impact utility as well as the number of people selected. More people increase utility. Now, rates of employees turnover and the level of performance among those who leave. To increase utility, turnover should be low with those living in low performance categories. So that is how utility is being defined. Now we go to the legality. Now, legality, these are all selection methods must conform to existing laws and legal precedent. Okay? Since we are working on a foreign reference, now the federal legislation. In the federal legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1991. This is an extension of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It protects individuals from discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, and national origin. So, and then with respect to hiring as well as compensation and working conditions. The 1991 Act differs from the 1964 Act in three different areas. So what are these differences? So number one, it defines employers' explicit obligation to establish the business necessity of any neutral appearing selection method that has an adverse impact on protected group. Another one is that it allows the individual filing the complaint to have a jury decide whether he or she may recover punitive damages in addition to lost wages and benefits for emotional injuries caused by the discrimination. Now, another one, the number three is the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967. Now, this act covers individuals who are over the age of 40, and there is no protection for younger workers, and therefore there is no case for reverse discrimination, meaning this act outlaws almost all mandatory retirement programs. Okay. Number three is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1991. Now, it protects individuals with physical or mental disabilities or with a history of the same. Now, reasonable accommodations are required by the organization to allow the disabled to perform essential functions of the job. For example, the examples of accommodation includes restructuring jobs, modifying work schedules, making facilities accessible, providing readers, or modifying equipment. Now, that is reasonable accommodation. An employer need to make accommodations that cause undue hardship, such as undue cost or danger to the safety of other employees. A very good example, uh, the first employment suit under the Americans with Disabilities Act was filed in November 1992 by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, charging a Chicago area security firm with illegally firing an executive director after he was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. Now, it is under the EEOC versus AIC Security Investigation Limited. Now, in announcing the suit, John Hendrickson, the regional attorney for the EEOCC's Chicago District Office, characterized the suit as a classic example of the type of discrimination the ADA is intended to prevent. Okay, Charles Wessel was fired. And then Hendrickson said, apparently not because of his inability to do the job, but because of predictions about future health problems and because of stereotyping fears about disability. Now, it appears that he was in fact performing his job up to the very time he was discharged. Now, the commission suit seeks back pay and monetary damages for the emotional and other harm Wessel alleges that he has suffered, as well as his reinstatement and an injunction prohibiting the company from engaging in unlawful discrimination based on disability. Now, this case were adopted from the EEOCC files for First Disabilities Act suit on behalf of executive with cancer. Okay? The reference is BNA's Employee Relations Weekly. Okay. Now, number 4 is that the executive branch of the government also regulate hiring decisions through the use of the executive orders. Now, the executive order 11246 parallels the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but goes beyond by requiring affirmative action to hire quality or qualified protected group applicants and allowing the government to suspend all businesses with a contractor while an investigation is going on. Now, the Office of the Federal Contract Compliance and Procedures issues guidelines and help companies comply. Now, what are the types of the selection methods? Now, the selection interviews are defined as a dialogue initiated by one or more persons to gather information and evaluate the qualifications of an applicant for employment. Now, it is the most widely used selection method, although research suggests that it can be unreliable and low invalidity and sometimes biased against a number of groups. Okay, the utility of an interview can be increased by the following suggestions and considerations. Now, interviews should be structured and should be standardized and focus on accomplishing and a small number of goals oriented to skills and behaviors that are observable. Okay? Now, interviews should also plan to come out of each interview with quantitative rating. Now, interviews also would consider have a structured note-taking system that will aid and recall when it comes to satisfying the ratings. Now, next is the situational interview. Now, what happens there? Now, it is an interview procedure where applicants are confronted with specific issues that is related, and then questions that is related, and problems that are also related, that are likely to arise on the job. And they will consist of the experience-based question mostly, and the future-oriented questions that is to be anticipated. There. So next would be for the selection and placement is the references, biographical data, application, gather background information on applicants before the interview. So that's the very essence. No? So there. No? So knowing briefly who are the applicants is important. Now, these techniques are at best weak predictors of future success, but then apparently it's a great tool for you to be able to start up. And then typically references are very positive since only those who the applicants know will give you a good reference. So that is mostly the case. When you give, they're familiar with the applicants, and definitely, it's good things will be expected. When you call up this referencing or references. Okay, and then many suits have been filed against past employees. Why? Because it's revealing too much information beyond job, title, years of service even. Now, the biggest concern with the use of biographical data is that the applicants who supply the information may be motivated to misrepresent themselves. So, to the point of being dishonest about the informations that they are giving. Next is the physical ability test. May be relevant for predicting not only the job performance but to predict the occupational injuries and disabilities as well in the future. And then the criterion related validities tend to be quite strong. Strong although adverse impact on the disabled and the women is highly possible. So these test measures will consist of the following: muscular tension, muscular power, muscular endurance, cardiovascular endurance, flexibility, balance, and coordination. So these are needed. Now, in the cognitive ability test, it is to differentiate the individual based on their mental rather than physical capacities. Now, one of the major drawbacks of these tests is that they typically have adverse impact on some minority groups that are, lacking in some of the educational backgrounds. And then, indeed, the size of the differences is so large that some have advocated actually abandoning these types of tests for making decisions regarding who will be accepted for certain jobs, no, for certain schools, for certain, yeah, that's it, no, jobs and work. Now, the cognitive ability normally are having this kind of test. So, what are these? Number one is the verbal comprehension. So, what are we trying to address here or see here? No, so verbal refers to comprehension refers to the person's capacity to understand and to use written and spoken words. Now, next is the quantitative ability. So, the speed and accuracy at which one can solve arithmetic problems. Okay, and the other one is the reasoning ability. Now, it referring to a person's capacity to invent solutions to many diverse problems. Okay, so if I may repeat, so these are the three cognitive ability tests: verbal comprehension, quantitative ability, and reasoning ability. Personality inventories categorize individuals relative to what they can do. Personality measures tend to categorize by what they are like. Now, common dimensions assess are extroversion, adjustments, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and inquisitiveness. So, these are personal inventories category. Now, evidence-based HR. It is essential actually to collect empirical evidence that validates the personality test in a specific context rather than assuming they will work because you were told that by a commercial developer of such test. And then another one is the work sample test, attempt to stimulate the job in pre-hiring context to observe how the applicant performs in a simulated job. So that is work sample. Now, work samples are job specific and tend to be high in criterion. Now, and content validity and low in adverse impact even. Now, the disadvantages are that generalizability tends to be low and they are relatively expensive to develop. And the technique used in managerial selection is the assessment center, which is a process in which multiple raters are engaged, evaluate employee performance on a number of exercises. Now, next is the honesty test and drug test. Now, the Polygraph Act of 1988 were banned the use of polygraph tests for private companies, except pharmaceuticals and security guard suppliers. Now, paper and pencil honesty testing attempts to assess the likelihood that employees will steal. Okay, since these tests are new, there is little evidence on their effectiveness. Now, drug use tests tend to be reliable and valid, particularly when screening tests. For example, immunoassay tests are follow up with more expensive confirmation. Immunoassay test. Okay, the major controversies are whether drug tests represent an invasion of privacy, an unreasonable search and seizure, or a violation of due process. At this point, there has not been much legislation or litigation happen. Now, these tests should be administered systematically to all applicants applying for the same job. And testing is likely to be more defensible when there are safety hazards associated with the failure to perform. Now, the test results should be reported to the applicant, who should have an avenue to appeal. And if current employees are tested, there should be a rehabilitation counseling available. Okay. So these are the things that are being covered in chapter 6 that talks about the selection and placement. So, okay. So I think we have established already the chapter and ended up the chapter with ample knowing about what it discusses. Okay, thank you very much and see you again next chapter discussion.